Pleasure to welcome you to this meeting of the Edinburgh Bibliographical Society. My name is Jerry McKeever. I teach Scottish literature at the University of Edinburgh here. And it's a real pleasure to welcome Brianna Robertson-Kirkland for this evening's lecture. Brianna is a lecturer in historical musicology at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in Glasgow. Her most recent publications include, can I pronounce this properly, Venanzio Rauzzini and the Birth of a New Style in English Singing, 2022, as well as Allan Ramsay's The Tea Table Miscellany, co-edited with Murray Pittock in 2023. She was the BSECS-Georgian Papers Fellow in 2023, where she's investigating Dorathea Jordan, a prima donna who is also known as the mistress of William IV. In 2023, she was granted a bursary from the WSG to conduct research for her new book, which is on Georgian Prima Donnas. Previously, she was the lead research associate for the AHRC-funded project, The Collected Works of Allan Ramsay at the University of Glasgow, and she's been a visiting fellow at Chawton House as well as the University of Sydney. Brianna's paper for us this evening is called Anatomy of a Song, Identifying the Songs in Allan Ramsay's Tea Table Miscellany. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jerry. And hello, everyone. So thank you for coming and listening to me on what was a very frosty evening in Glasgow, but seems to be less frosty over on this end of the woods. So from 2018 to 2023, I was part of a project team that delivered this collection of works. So this is Allan Ramsay's, the collected work of Allan Ramsay, which is now complete and fully published. And I think Murray likes to boast that it is the fastest publication of a collection that has ever been produced. I'm not entirely sure if that's true, but we did do it in 5 years. And through this project, I was given the opportunity to co-edit with Professor Murray Pittock the Tea Table Miscellany, which is volume 4 of the series. The Tea Table Miscellany is a collection of songs. It appears in 4 volumes, published between 1723 and 1737. And I'm going to be talking about how I investigated the musical side of the volume. Murray primarily dealt with the literary side. I dealt with the music. Although we did have to cross over quite a lot of the time. So there'll be some discussion on the text, but I'm mainly going to be focusing on the music. Now, hailed by Alexander Law, one of the editors of the Scottish Text Society's edition of the Gentle Shepherd, as a bestseller, Allan Ramsay's 4-volume Tea Table Miscellany was one of the most successful collections of songs published in 18th century Britain. It was, as pointed out by Claire Nelson and Catherine Campbell and Christine McHugh, TTM inspired generations of Scots song collections and collectors, including Robert Burns, James Johnson, and George Thompson, who continued to edit and reproduce Scots song for a variety of audiences throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. And despite its importance, no scholarly edition of the Tea Table Miscellany had ever been produced until the Edinburgh collection. The publication was released in 2023 and is now available to purchase through the Edinburgh University Press website, although it is quite pricey. So if you do have access to an institutional library, then I'd maybe direct you there, unless you're very, very keen, in which case do purchase it. A lot of work went into it. There's a lot of music. There's a lot of notes for you to see where all the music and the songs come from. It offers for the first time annotations, background, and a study of the origins for all of the songs and tunes, examining both Ramsay's categorization of the authorship and origin of the song text, and tunes to which he was most likely referring to within the publication. And while some scholars have investigated the origins of certain songs, including Campbell and McHugh, who considered the musical origins of Nanio, Matthew Gelbart, who examined the musical origins of the Gaelic song Cymru Macatol, and Killiecrankie, and Ross Duffin, who investigated the musical origins of Barbara Allen, it was us who was the first to carry out an extensive investigation of all of the songs of the collection. So Before I begin, let me give you a little bit of background into where we actually found some of these volumes, because even identifying the volumes themselves is a little bit tricky. So we've always known that there were 4 volumes, and we've always had access to be able to see the 4 volumes, but we only had the physical access to the print copies of TTM1 and TTM4. The other 2, TTM2 and 3, we only had facsimiles for, which came from the British Library. So throughout the project, there was a lot of questions about these 2 volumes, which I'm going to get into throughout this lecture. But firstly, we had questions about the frontispieces. They look similar, but there are some differences between all 4 of the fronts. And there was also differences inside. So we were really keen to get our hands on the print copy to see exactly if there was additional evidence, additional things that might tell us why there is any differences. Through the work of my colleague Craig Lamont, who was a fellow research associate with me on this project, he was actually able to identify that these 2 in the middle, the real copies of those, the real print copies, belonged to Melbourne House. Now, how the journey to actually getting to be able to see these volumes, once we had identified them, was quite complex, because he'd identified them during COVID, and Melbourne House, like many, many other places at that time, was not available to open. So we had to wait until they were available, and Craig then went down, and he was able to see and identify that, yes, these were the copies that were held as facsimile copies through the British Library. And from there, we were then able to check that the facsimiles had no missing pages. They actually did have missing pages, and some were blanked out. So we're really glad to be able to get the print copy. And that meant that then when I went to go and investigate the tunes and the musical side, I had a lot more information to work off of. If I hadn't been able to see the print copies, there were certain songs that I simply wouldn't have been able to identify. Now, TTM1 and TTM2, they mostly follow the same style. There's similarities in its format, there's similarity in how Ramsay articulates what the tune is, sets out the lyrics, identifies authorship. All of that is very similar between the first 2 volumes. And there was very little time between their publication date, 23 and 26. So we're talking a 3-year period. And in the midst of that, he was actually working on The Gentle Shepherd, which is perhaps his most famous work. So in 1725, he published the play, The Gentle Shepherd. And then in 1729, he published the ballad opera version of The Gentle Shepherd, which borrowed many of the songs from the Miscellany. So when we get on to the 3rd volume, even though that was published just a year after number 2, there's a lot of differences, which I'll get into in a moment, which then made us question how much involvement Ramsay really had in this collection. Now, we suspect that he did have the same involvement as the other 2, but that for some reason he decided to adopt a different format, and that he took a, dare I say, lazier approach to producing it, and perhaps a bit of a cash grab. And I'll explain why I'm saying that in just a few moments' time. The 4th volume was published 10 years after the 3rd volume. And this was considerably different in style, considerably different in the way that he was pulling collections of songs together, which again, I will explain in a moment. So that gives you a little bit of background to each of the 4 volumes. When it came to the music, we also had several questions that we had to ask. So you can see here that when Ramsay was printing, so TTM1, this was his format, and anyone who knows the tune knows that Bonnie Kirsty is the title of the tune, and then he gives the lyrics. So he doesn't state explicitly to the tune of Bonnie Kirsty, but you pretty much know, well, Bonnie Kirsty is the title, therefore it must be the tune of the song. And if you scan the text to the tune, it works. Just about. And in volume 2, he explicitly states the tune. He does this in volume 1 as well. He kind of changes it between title and tune. He does the same in volume 2. But here, To Clorinda, a song is to the tune of "I wish my love were in a mire." And so he does that consistently throughout. Makes my life a bit easier at trying to identify what tunes are. It's told me what the tune is. Wonderful. TTM3, however, all he gives me is song 1. Now, sometimes the first line of the tune, or sorry, the first line of the song is enough for me then to be able to identify what the tune was. But actually, most often I had to do a little bit more digging to try and find exactly what this tune was. Unfortunately, I was able to find it on most occasions because it was publishing the songs of others. Occasionally, there were times when it seemed like he'd written his own text and then also had told us what the tune was. So exactly how it was supposed to be sung is unclear. And finally, in TTM4, he sort of returns to what he did in TTM1 and TTM2, but not always. He's kind of doing a bit of a mix of TTM1 and 2 and also 3. So it became a little bit harder to identify exactly what the song was. So that was some of the complications that we had to go through. Now I'm using tune, text, song quite deliberately here. So what is a song? Seems kind of obvious, except when it comes to scholarship, because a lot of the work that has been done on Ramsay, when it is saying we're investigating the songs, only looked at the text, didn't really look at the music. We knew that a lot of this was intended for performance, and in order to perform it, you need to know what the tune is to be able to sing the song. Therefore, you need to know what the tune is and how exactly it scans to that tune. So a lot of my work was actually investigating how exactly to do that. Ramsay, often his text does scan very well to the tune that he picks, but as time wore on, it fits less and less, and then we then have questions about, well, how exactly did Ramsay intend this to be performed? Did he intend it to be performed? Did he have a different tune in mind? Because on occasions, tunes have similar titles, but they've actually changed or they've evolved over time. And so what I was doing was going back to early sources and trying to see what that evolution was to then determine what tune did Ramsay have in mind when he was setting his song. And indeed, what was in the minds of those in Edinburgh? Because if I go back to this slide, you will see there's one key thing missing. I wonder if anyone can point to it. There's no notes, there's no notation, there's no music. All he gives is the tune. So then I'm questioning, well, how do people know what the tune was? It must have been in public circulation at the time. And so we will know tunes like Auld Lang Syne and Baba Black Sheep. These are ones that are in popular vernacular. We can probably round them off at the top of our head. If we move more into a more complex classical repertoire, more modern repertoire, and the things that are in films and TV, people can rhyme off fairly quickly, and it was no different in 18th century Edinburgh. So I'm fairly confident that most of the tunes that he was selecting, he was expecting that his audience who would purchase these volumes would know how they were supposed to sound. That does become a lot more complex, though, when we look at TTM3 and 4, and I'll explain that towards the end of the lecture. So what is a song? Well, a song consists of text, it consists of a tune, and I was primarily interested in the tune side. Now, what's important is that our edition was quite distinct from most editions because of this. And actually, if you look at the edition, if you do come to purchase it or you come to have a look at it, in the notes, you will see that there is notation that has been included. Now, that notation is not to tell you how to sing the song per se. The notation is there to show the sources that I was looking at and then I have transcribed. Because some of the sources were in looped notation, which is not in standard staff notation. And so I transcribed it so that any musician or anyone who reads music would be able to read it clearly. How do you know where this music came from? Well, Allan Ramsay, he was involved in the production of this little pocket book. The book is about just the top of this A4, that's it in its entirety. So it's a tiny, tiny book that just fits in the pocket. This was only for the tunes for TTM1. Now there are some repeats that you can see in TTM2 and in TTM4, but at the time of this publication, it was very clear that it was relating only to TTM1. Here you can see it's music for Allan Ramsay's collection of Scots songs. There are certain copies of this that write in 71 Scots songs, and that's particularly interesting because there's not 71 songs in Ramsay's volume. There's 88 songs. So we have quite a few missing songs from the collection. So what exactly is missing? Well, we do have some repeats. So we have repeat tunes like the Broom of Cowden House, where Ramsay then pens different lyrics. This was very common in the 18th century Scotland. You would have a tune and you pen brand new lyrics to them. So we have the Broom of Cowden House, the Yellow-Haired Laddies, another song that I particularly liked. Auld Lang Syne is there a few times as well, as is Mary Scott. And there were some unique compositions as well. So Lorenzo Bocchi was an Italian immigrant who had come to Scotland, and Ramsay seems to have been working with him, and they had produced at least this one Scots cantata, possibly were involved in other projects together as well. Now the music was published separately, and then we have the text appearing in TTM1. It's very clear that people would not have been able to easily access or not been able to sing directly from TTM, the Scots cantata. It was a unique composition, you needed the music. But then Ramsay sold that too, so you just have to buy two books instead of one. How's that? So we do have unique compositions, and he didn't, that doesn't appear in Stuart's volume. These are the title pages for each one of Stuart's volumes. So we've got the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. We still have 9 missing songs. My theory is that there's a missing book. That either it was intended for production, which is the likely answer, and it was never put into production. The reason why I think that is because this book itself seems to have been quite cheaply made. So even though it's got music notation in it, which is quite expensive to produce, you needed unique symbols in order to produce it, and a lot of people were producing music in Edinburgh. And the person who was actually putting together this book doesn't seem to have been a musician themselves. They were copying from a musical source, but they often get notes backwards. And sometimes they do strange rhythmic choices, and they do strange beaming choices. Almost like when they were copying from the original handwritten source, if there was anything that was unclear, they were then making educated guesses as to what it could be and not quite getting it right. There's also blots and just errors that are throughout, which are just typographical errors that are happening within the volume. So it seems to have been quickly produced and not produced at a very high standard. Despite that, though, we do have a few copies of this in production, and so we can see that this was the music that clearly Ramsay, and working with Alexander Stewart, that he had intended to be used in conjunction with TTM. So people would have likely had to purchase this as well as purchasing TTM if they wanted to know exactly how to set up the tune. You need both because there's no text in here, there's only the music, just as in TTM. No text. Now, getting back to volumes. So, yep, let me go back to the beginning. Thank you. That's all right. So that's TTM 1 and 2. TTM 1, we have a good idea of exactly how the songs are to be sung. We have music. It's very useful indeed. 9 are missing. That's a bit of an annoyance, but when I was investigating those 9 songs, I was very quickly able to find them because most of the tunes are Scots tunes. There were plenty of sources to be able to identify what happens in Mega Carrot in his head. TTM2, he was using quite a lot of the same tunes again. So we had a good idea of what tunes he had in mind. I was able to identify a number of sources that told me what that tune sounded like at the time, from handwritten sources to print sources. So it was useful and easy to be able to track down exactly what might have been in mind. Ramsay is also the author for many of these songs, and he credits fellow authors wherever he borrows from somebody else. He does use X and Z to indicate when it's an old song, telling us that he clearly either found it in circulation or he had picked up the song but didn't know who the author was. And again, I was able to trace it back often to 17th century ballad collections and broadside ballads, but then who exactly the author was of broadside ballads is often unclear because they didn't publish who authors were in those cases. So fairly acceptable as to why Ramsay would say it's just an old song about authorship. 3 and 4, as I said in the beginning, a lot more complicated. In part because of formatting, but also because of authorship. He's not as considerate of other authors in these volumes. He doesn't indicate authorship in quite the same way that he did in TTM 1 and TTM 2. So some of the tunes throughout TTM 1 are found in English song collections, which was a surprising find at the time because Ramsay had made such a big deal of it being a Scots collection drawing from Scots origins. But we actually did find quite a number of the tunes in English collections, including Wit and Mirth, or Pills to Purge Melancholy. I thought I had a slide for that. Such as Wit and Mirth, or Pills to Purge Melancholy, or The Merry Musician, the musical Miscellany, and a variety of publications by John and Henry Playford. Most are also found in a variety of Scottish manuscripts prior to Ramsay, including TTM. So the Broom of Cowden House, I had been able to identify the tune in a number of places. So that's including all of these sources here. So we have the earliest source for it was The Lovely Northern Lass, which appeared in Ewing Ballads 166. So that's from a broadside ballad collection. But then I was able to also find it in handwritten manuscript collections, including from the Weems collection and from the Guthrie collection. Both Weems and Guthrie was likely handwritten by a music teacher for their female student or by the female student themselves. These were owned by women and not owned by men. The reason why sometimes I think it might have been a music teacher is because the hand itself was fairly confident. And then other places in the book, the hand was less confident, indicating a master-student relationship of writing into the same manuscript book. But this does tell us that this particular tune was in popular circulation and was being used by a variety of people and performed in a variety of ways. So you can see down here, BSECS the Light and the Cittern appears in the Bonnie Broom, which is the broom of Caledonia. And it was a solo piece for Cittern at the time. The first time the tune is mentioned, the notated tune, so this is where we can see it in the broadside ballad. So you can see The Lovely Northern Lass as it appears here. Again, there is no music, but we have text here. And the text, once again, is different to Ramsay. Ramsay borrowing from that broadside ballad collection, that broadside ballad tradition. And here it appears in the Weems. So this is written out in lute notation or Cittern notation. And this has been fully transcribed in the edition and staff notation so that everyone is able to read it. So this is an example of a fairly confident hand that is writing in, but there are other examples in the manuscript where the hand is less confident. So when we get to things like this, where Ramsay is saying to the tune of Look Harbour no more, or at last with a lump of land, again, we can give examples of the sources that backs up the tune. So TTM2, as I said, it was constructed in a near identical manner, and tunes were either indicated, as you can see here, or they were simply given as the title. And again, the tunes were found in a variety of Scots and English print and manuscript sources. So this is an example of R92, or Song to the Tune of Valiant Jockey, on a beautiful but very young lady. And the tune is given in the following sources. So Playford, he was an English musician, English publisher, and who was producing a number of music collections in the 17th century, and then his son actually took over and started producing collections later in the 17th century, early 18th century. And so there are a number of tunes that appears in Ramsay that appeared in many of Playford's works. Youth's Delight is similarly an English collection. But then you can also see that it's appeared in Scots collections as well. So Leiden being a manuscript source. And here you can see that the earliest sources actually describe it as a Scots tune. So again, showing that there must have been some kind of cross-pollination between Scotland and England. Of course, the two countries are very close to one another, and musicians have a tendency to travel up and down. And so there's no reason why they shouldn't have described it as Scots. But as is the case with most of collections at this time, sometimes Scots, Irish, English, rarely Welsh, but they're used interchangeably. So an Irish tune is often then later described as a Scots tune, or back and forth, or what was presumed to be a Scots tune is actually a bit of English theatre music that has been put together in such a way to make one think that it is Scots. So this was something that we had to be aware of, especially since Ramsay was making the claim that his collection was Scots, with promoting Scotland in itself, that he was actually borrowing quite a lot of tunes from English theatre collections. As noted by Matthew Gilbert, Scots tunes in England had nearly no clear-cut definition in musical technical terms, despite the term commonly applied in major song collections, such as those published by Playford and others. And in any case, Ramsay was continuing to select and use tunes in circulation in both England, Scotland, and Ireland as well. So Look Harbour no more is a really good example of the English, Irish, and Scottish cross-pollination. So these are all the sources where I was able to identify the tune, and all of the elements combined, text either by Ramsay's authorship or text by another author, edited by Ramsay, tune titles or indications of the tune, and ornaments, demonstrate that Ramsay had a consistent format for both TTM1 and TTM2, even though TTM1 was printed in 1723 and TTM2 was printed in 1726. TTM3 stands apart. It was produced, as a reminder, in 1727, so just 1 year after TTM2, but there's quite a distinct change. So you can see here, there's no song title given. All you have is song 1, song 2, song 3. And the tunes are not indicated, so you do not get to the tune of. There's only one example where he states that there's a song that was sung by Pincanello, Mary Andrew to Roberto in the Montebank Doctor, which actually gave me a very clear indication that this was a song that had come from a ballad opera that was being performed in England in the early 18th century. So that was very useful for Ramsay to actually tell me that, but he doesn't do this with regularity throughout TTM3. It's a rarity when these indications appeared. So it was an explicit statement that he pulled from London theatre productions. That made me then question, well, how much access did an Edinburgh audience have to London theatre productions? There were certain people who were certainly travelling back and forth and would be able to see London theatre music and would probably enjoy it and purchase the music and want to play it in their homes. But how many people are actually going to be able to do that, who are likely to purchase Ramsay's TTM. And so he seems to have a bit of a mixed audience that he's trying to pull from, those who would know about London Theatre music and those who might not necessarily know about it, but we know quite a lot of Scots songs. All the rest are simply song with a chronological number. And all the reader, or indeed the performer, has to help them identify the tune is the text itself, which requires them to have a working knowledge of where the text originated, particularly since Ramsay provides no information on this front, excepting on Song 48. When first confronted with this volume, me and my colleague Craig Lamont considered if this was even a Ramsay original, but there were enough consistencies for us to rule out that it was a fake, that it was a forgery. The ornaments was a big indication of this. So the ornaments here, there are a lot of Ruddiman ornaments who had been Ramsay's long-term partner in printing these particular works. And this was consistent throughout all 4 volumes. So we were pretty confident in seeing that the ornaments were being reproduced across the volumes, that Ruddiman was involved. If Ruddiman was involved, then Ramsay must have been involved. How involved Ramsay was, though, was a bigger question, one that we've not really been able to solve. The title page is also consistent with the same engraver, who was Richard Cooper, who produced TTM1 and TTM2. Even so, removing the tune titles is a big change and one that impacts on the user's experience. For example, some songs, including R158, Song 2, Send Home My Long Straight Eyes to Me, had more than one musical setting. So Send Home My Long Straight Eyes to Me was set by 3 times by Anthony Young, and then was later set by the composer and singer Richard Leveridge in 1727. And even though Ramsay prints the text, there's no way of determining which version of the song he was referring to, or indeed if he knew of all the musical settings available for purchase. So I could have assumed that it was Richard Leveridge's version, since that was the more popular and well-known, Richard Leveridge being a very popular singer-actor at the time, but it also very well might have been Anthony Young or any one of Anthony Young's versions. So I haven't stated in the volume which one it could have been. I simply said there were all these available, it could have been any of them. Other songs are direct lifts, often with no edits from the published English song collection, which largely reprinted songs performed on the London Theatre stage. Indeed, several songs were published in the Monthly Mass of Vocal Music, a periodical which, Berta Yonkis notes, was produced by John Walsh, who repackaged musical numbers from London theatres, concerts, and privately organised entertainments. Songs found in both TTM3 and the Monthly Mass included song 25, Why So Pale and One Fond Lover, and this song, song 29, The Ordnance Board, also Comfort I Miscarried, which was song 56. However, to sing these songs when coming across them in TTM3, the user needed to have heard the song or seen the production of the theatrical, or have a copy of the music to be able to recognise the lyrics and know which tune it would be sung to. Simply put, if Ramsay was intending consumers to perform the songs found in TTM3 as songs, he was assuming a hefty level of knowledge, arguably too much knowledge for your standard buyer. The alternative is that Ramsay was not intending the songs in TTM3 to be performed at all, but simply to be read. And yet this too jars with what scholars, including David McGuinness and Aaron McGregor, have argued with regards to Ramsay's intentions on how TTM was to be used. And McGregor and McGuinness basically the following: the lack of an authoritative extant musical text emphasises that Ramsay expected the music of the songs to be heard rather than read. He had no need to present musical notation because he could hear the tunes in his head and could assume to some extent that his readers had knowledge of similar repertoire, what has been described as common stock tunes. Now, examining the print history of TTM1 and other publications that followed, demonstrates that while Ramsay might not have initially anticipated an appetite for a song collection that included notated music, there certainly was one. And the reason why I say this is because there was another song collection that was produced that ripped off Ramsay, essentially. William Thomson, he produced Orpheus Caledonians in 1725, and he lifted the vast majority of Ramsay's text from TTM1, set it to music on staff notation, and he printed that in London. Ramsay was livid when he realised this, and he actually said, in TTM1, the 1730 edition, he made this comment. This by I thought proper to intimate and do myself that justice which the publisher neglected, since he ought to have acquainted his illustrious list of subscribers that most of the songs were mine, the music abstracted. So he's pointing out to people that Thomson has taken his songs, taken his text, and he set them to music on staff notation, but he neglected to inform anyone that it was actually Ramsay's songs to begin with. And what Thomson then did was that he produced another version of Orpheus Caledonians, so a second edition, but he still did not credit Ramsay for any of the songs that he took. All he simply did was simplify some of the tunes. It is essentially a reproduction of Orpheus Caledonians from 1725. Now, Ramsay's objection was not to printing music, but to Thomson stealing his text. Ramsay's words did not deter Thomson producing his second volume of Orpheus Caledonians in 1733, though. So perhaps after seeing the success of Orpheus Caledonians, this is why Ramsay decided to work with Alexander Stewart to produce music for Allan Ramsay's Scott songs, which printed a number of the tunes, though not all. At least for TTM1, Ramsay was offering the mechanisms to enable performance, initially by stating the tune title and then by Stewart's publication, providing music notation for about 70% of the songs. TTM3 doesn't offer a mechanism such like this, leading me to conclude that these songs were not intended for performance, but rather they were instead intended to be spoken or to simply be read. It's strange why Ramsay would abandon his performance format, but this is why I also think that Ramsay was perhaps not as involved in the production of TTM3. At this time, he was producing multiple versions of Gentle Shepherd. He was working for those to be performed. He was heavily involved in his own publishing house. He was also heavily involved in trying to establish theatre in Edinburgh at this time as well, and not getting very far as a result of that. So it could be that he was trying to produce a third volume as a bit of a cash grab, and to ensure that TTM was continuing to make money, and that even new buyers would then be encouraged who hadn't purchased the first two volumes to go and purchase those in addition to TTM3. Getting on to TTM4. Now, as you can see here, TTM4 aligns with the printing style of TTM1 and 2 for the most part. There are a fewer instances where he states to the tune of, instead relying on readers to know the tune from the title alone. So here, the Burks in Vermeer, you have to know that is the tune, but that would have been fairly well known at the time. There were many manuscripts that have Burks in Vermeer that was handwritten into their manuscript. The volume also reintroduces songs with direct Scottish connections. So, for example, R269 is Ettrick Banks. So this again is directly related to the Scottish connections rather than it pulling from English theatre music, although it did pull from there too. Ettrick Banks and Robertson and Vermeer are the first two songs in TTM4. And both of these songs were printed by William Thomson in his 1733 edition of Orpheus Caledonians, which was published 4 years before Ramsay released TTM4. So there's a bit of take-backsies was going on between those two. Ramsay, the author, also returns to write a few of the texts in TTM4, including Watty and Marge, in imitation of William and Margaret. And so this is William and Margaret as it appears in Orpheus Caledonius. And it already been printed in TTM2 as well. And Watty and Madge was a lovely callback to the previous version. A tune already associated with William and Margaret, as printed in Thomson's 1725 Orpheus Caledonius, and was likely the tune Ramsay intended for this burlesque version of the song. What also appears are several songs from the London Theatre as well, so a merging of TTM3 into TTM4, and we have an example of that here. A great lamentation for the loss of sweet Senesino. Senesino was a very, very popular castrato at the time in London, and he had been one of Handel's main singers at the time. But by the time of 1737, he hadn't quite passed away yet, but he was on his last legs. So it was pretty much known that Senesino was on his way out. Now, it was originally published as the Lady's Lamentation for the loss of Senesino, sung by Mr. Roberts in the British Musical Miscellany in 1735. Though Ramsay also altered some of the text before he published it. And it's possible Ramsay had a copy of the British Musical Miscellany to hand, as quite a few of the songs appearing in this collection were also printed in TTM4. So this also included this song here, which was The Wise Penitent, sung by Mr. Gay, which was an example where it seems Ramsay was referring to a song sung in a particular production, though he does not say exactly which one. The song is actually Daphnis and Chloe, a ballad authored by John Gay and published in 1720. And printing the songs without music, Ramsay was again relying on his readers to know the tune from either hearing it or performed or playing the notated music themselves, which he did not provide, so they'd have to have that to hand in a moment. For those tunes in common circulation, those appearing in TTM1, TTM2, it was perhaps not unreasonable to assume that readers would know them, easily find out what the tune is from someone they knew. For these London theatre songs, however, I question just how well known they were to Ramsay's Edinburgh-based readers. Now, I've talked quite a lot about how exactly this, I was identifying these tunes and questioning performance. And the reason why I was doing this was because the music itself we intended to perform. And we did indeed, we recorded it with this lovely group of musicians. And we produced the album Shepherds and Tea Tables, which was also released in 1723. In performing the music, we had even more considerations. So because Ramsay provides no staff notation, we then had to make decisions about musical arrangement. And we drew from a number of sources to be able to do this, selecting instruments that would have been performed and played at the time, and also thinking about singers and singers' voices and how they would suit the music as well. So one might assume that if you're singing Scots traditional music, which is what a lot of these tunes are now today, that one would use a Scots traditional singer. And we did, in some cases, use a Scots traditional singer. We used a few Scots traditional singers to perform some of this music. But we also recognised that at the time, there were a number of singers who were receiving Italian training from those who were available in Scotland as well. And so their voices may not have been the sound of the Scots traditional singer, and it's even, we have to question exactly what that would have sounded like in the 18th century, but they might have had a bit more of a trained voice in a classical style, where we do have a lot more sources to tell us what that training was like and what it might have sounded like. So on the album, you hear both versions. You hear the more trained singer, which was Mary Lawson and Thomas Walker, and you hear the more traditional sound from some of our singers who were performing. So I have a couple of examples here to be able to show you. So the first is All Rob Morris, which was sung by Iona Fife, who was the Scots Singer of the Year a few years ago, and she made 8 now perform ballads. Play that for you.
Meet the Ninja Turtles in Hero Wars. The legendary RPG Hero Wars welcomes new Rob Morris.
Sitting beyond the weather, he's a king of old-fitted fellows. All the better, as for of affection. Oh, the Rob Morris is from the Yvonne. Oh, hold your tongue, leather, so happy. For his youth and my youth, they'll never agree. They sing, for he is who score about 15.
So you can hear there, it's taking the more Scots traditional sound, and the song is it's a bit of a naughty song. So that was partly a reasoning for selecting these singers to perform this particular song. But we also had to think very carefully about range. So the range of some of these songs is quite large, and Sinead and Iona, often with a number of the songs, really struggled to meet that range, which in some cases could be as much as 3 or 4 octaves. Someone whose voice is not trained in the classical style really struggles to be able to hit all of that range of notes. So that was when we called in our classical singers, who still found it a challenge, don't get me wrong, but they had a bit more of the mechanisms and capability to be able to navigate that range. And so here's an example of another song. This is by our 2 classically trained singers, Thomas Walker and Mary Lawson. And I'll give you the introduction to this one as well, because the instrumentalists they played this very beautifully.
These hands are the most valuable tools that I have. They get dry, they get cracked. I discovered how keeps working hands.
A hen of tree upon the plain, hate and his peggy need. In love we out a vicious stain, the bonny lass and cheerful swain shine vows and kisses sweet. And in the first
When the convicts with yellow and blue rising bells, ye bands brand of lands, give trouble to me. Give up and the glen is recht right and when.
So you can hear this is an example of a tune, which is the Yellow-Haired Laddie, but it's a text that was written by Ramsay. So here we have an example of Ramsay adopting those tunes and then penning his own text, in which he does several times throughout all the volumes. So this is also an example of a tune where it has a very wide range, and so you're having to do quite a lot of leaps to be able to navigate that. When we dropped it down a little bit, it was easier for the other singers to be able to navigate, but it still is quite a big stretch. And so it was useful to be able to experiment with different singers and different kinds of training. Now, of course, this tells us absolutely nothing about who the singers were and how they would have performed this in the 18th century. But it gives us a useful idea of knowing how the songs should sound if you put the text and tune together. Song, for the most part, he has a consistent approach. He provides a tune and he provides lyrics. And for TTM 1 and 2, the tunes were distinctly Scottish and part of Ramsay's musical culture. For TTM 4, it's a little bit more odd in that most of the tunes were London show tunes. And so one could question if Ramsay really did know the song in some instance, or if he was simply reprinting what's already available in other collections to make a quick sale to his Edinburgh audience. And this perhaps seems like the most logical answer. As for TTM3, the new format is still a bit of a mystery. And the pragmatic side of me thinks that Ramsay might have simply tried to quickly capitalise on the success of the first two volumes without putting the same effort into selecting and editing appropriate songs. Now, what the Edinburgh edition of TTN has managed to do is unite all 4 volumes in one, tracing both the musical and the textual history of most of the songs. And there are only a few exceptions where I wasn't able to find anything at all. So 95% of the songs that appear there have been traced. Now, we hope that this is going to enable musicians and literary scholars alike to help with their understanding and oversight of Ramsay's popular song collection, and indeed to understand a little more of what was available to Edinburgh audiences in the 18th century. Thank you very much.
Questions? Anyone? Answer?
Yes, do we know that the audience were not playing a great game of one song and tune of another and supplying whatever tune they had?
They possibly could have, although that's where scanning becomes really important. So there are some tunes where the song is very, or the text is very clearly set to that tune, because it scans particularly well. But that's not to say that there weren't buyers who then decided to sing said song to a different tune if they could make it fit. And indeed, this song collection, if you're buying it and purchasing it in your own house, why not? And so they very well can do that.
And are there bits of it that would work better than others? Because some of them, it looked like quite a lot of the tunes were things like, or turning up in other sorts of like playing with English Dancing Master.
Yeah.
Where I think they tend to be much more regular because they're dance tunes.
Because they're dance tunes. And again, audiences would have known that. So quite a lot of the play for Dancing Master tunes would have also been dances that were performed up here. And so you would have known the tune through there and been able to scan it very, I'm assuming quite easily, because you would have known the tune and likely would have known the tune in its regular pulse, because you know it as a dance tune as opposed to knowing it as a song tune.
I can cut in with the question. It's really interesting to that sense of the way that the material, at times is kind of projecting this commonly understood musical culture, and then at times going away from that, or it's at least more ambivalent in its relationship to this kind of, I guess, folk knowledge. But having now done this work, I'd be really interested what your kind of overall estimation of Ramsay is musically. So we're used to thinking about him as a great influence on the vernacular revival in the 18th century, really important civic figure in Edinburgh, important in the history of libraries and book selling. But where do you see him in the story of the musical culture of Scotland in the 18th century then?
Well, I'll answer that in 2 parts. So in terms of Ramsay's musical ability himself, he very clearly didn't play an instrument himself or have musical training that we would say is formal, because the way that he puts his songs to the tunes is not intuitively how I as a singer would then sing it. That's not to say that maybe singers at the time would have, and so there could be a bit of a disconnect between me in the 21st century and me in the 18th century, and I recognise that. But also looking at other sources from the time, where there is that are put together by singers themselves, where it does match with my understanding of how a song should be performed. Ramsay doesn't always do that, so that's where I'm thinking, okay, his songs work, His songs work about 90% of the time, but there's clearly an informal understanding of how it all works that he's kind of learning on the fly. Or he knows because of his musical culture, rather than having any formal training to be able to do that. In terms of Ramsay's influence on musical culture in Edinburgh, though, that is huge. The very fact that he produced TTN is what influenced Burns to then produce his song collections, and then influenced George Thomson to produce his song collections, which then influenced many 19th century collections we produced, which is still influencing us today in the 21st century. So Ramsay really is that first pin in understanding Scotland's musical culture in print sources. If it weren't for him, we may never have had Burns.
That's good. Do we sometimes take questions from chat?
Yeah, I've got one from Sally. Fascinating talk, thank you very much. If I have not misunderstood, you felt that a number of items in TTN3 were not intended to be sung but only spoken. Can you explain a bit more about how you came to this conclusion?
So that's because he doesn't indicate the tune. He doesn't tell us what the tune is, and there's no way of identifying the tune. So even if you put the first line of text, which in TTM 1, 2, and 4 usually comes up with a tune that will be similar title. That's not the case in TTM 3, and a number of the tunes are from London theatre music. And so you would have to have been able to go to the London Theatre, know that tune, and come back. And sometimes the ballad operas are only performed for one season and then they disappeared off the face of the planet. So how many members of the Edinburgh audiences that were purchasing TTM 3, how many of them would actually know that music, would know that tune, and be able to perform it in their own homes? I think it's really, really low. And for that reason, I can only come to the logical conclusion that then Ramsay wasn't intending it to be sung at all, and that it's going to be read, or it's going to appear just as a collection on somebody's shelf to complete the TTM books that were all available for purchase.
Great, thank you.
One more question is that's not. I was also really interested. We were talking about the kind of evolution in his process, where he begins being very diligent about citations.
Oh yes.
I've
got a nice slide.
Yeah, so knowing where he's getting things from, and then ultimately becoming much looser and freer in that. And as someone who's worked on Burns, I recognise that latter practice much more, as people tend, that's more common, I think, to be quite loose. And how would you understand that progression? Do you think that's rooted in the rivalry with Thomson, or is that Ramsay?
No, so in 1723, there wasn't yet a rivalry established. So you can see here in the contents page, it says the following marks C, D, H, L, M, O, etc. are words in different hands, and then he very meticulously indicates. So there, Z, Muirland Billy is an example of it's an unknown authorship, and he's stating that explicitly. But then others, he's saying who they are, although not explicitly saying who they are. But through letters, we kind of have some of the authors, and we know who some of the authors are. So he's clearly in 1723, and then in his next edition in 1724, being very careful about saying where exactly these songs have come from in terms of the text. By the time he gets on to TTM 2, 3, and 4, I don't know whether it's that he thought audiences just didn't care, and he just didn't have time to go into that detail of editing. Certainly by 3 and 4, there does seem to be an element of let's capitalize as much as we possibly can on what we've already produced and was popular. He sort of abandoned that practice entirely. And it makes sense, he's becoming a busier and busier man, and he's not taking as much time to cite his sources. Exactly his reasoning though for why he abandoned the practice, that is unclear, so I can only speculate. And Burns notoriously may cited his sources, and the citations that he provides might not be true.
Well, I think that's us. Shall we have another round of applause for Brianna, please? Thank you very much.